Ahu whenau. Ata mārie. I'd like to thank the conference organisers for the invitation to speak, but particularly for their amazing mahi to move this event online at such short notice. To begin this session, she says, trying to figure out how to change the slide. To begin the session, I'm going to present some work that was planned during the 2020 lockdown, with the majority of the work done between July and September last year. I'd also like to acknowledge that although there's only one person speaking right now, this work was done by a very large team that was put together at very short notice to deliver the work in a very short time frame. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the input of Bill K. Blake and Prince Sidrath through NZARES Public Good Fund. So to begin with, I'm going to take you back to 2020 because we all want to go there, right? Just to remind you, this graphic gives a timeline of the shutdown in New Zealand. You'll probably remember the sense of anticipation through January and February. We knew something was on the way, but not quite what or when. And then there was that Sunday evening broadcast from the Prime Minister, followed by a swift move into level 4 lockdown. This was during April and May last year. And at the same time, there was a call for papers describing the impacts of COVID-19 on agriculture and food systems worldwide. This is from the Agricultural Systems Journal, of course, something I'm not unrelated to. This led to a core group from New Zealand and Australia doing a high-level design for a study that we could deliver during lockdown that would describe those immediate effects. So we started the work in July, and it reports on the effects of COVID-19 from January to June that year. For further context, and just showing you the plot of the usual monthly visitor arrivals into New Zealand. Personally, I always knew it was really high, but I didn't realise at monthly average was 7% of a resident population every month. And of course, that slammed down to almost nothing within weeks. Of course, it also led to some touching points, such as this departure of the last flight of the repatriation series for the 12,000 German visitors that were stranded in New Zealand by the lockdown. And finally, just to remind you, this is what our COVID-19 curve looked like back at that time, up to the point where we submitted the paper. And we did the interviews during July and August. Of course, it doesn't look quite the same today. It's unfortunately why we're not, as everybody says, in Nelson enjoying some wine. So just a little bit about our methods and timeline. In June, we formed a team of 29 researchers, and I'd just like to say that we really benefited from the interest of the people who responded to our survey at that time, and particularly to the people that made themselves available for structured interviews. They were mostly farmers, growers and industry body leaders because they had the overview of what the impacts were. And we were interviewing them and consuming their time and energy at a time that they were still dealing with the fallout of the lockdown. So without them, this work would not have been possible. So ngā mihi nui ki a rātou. The key point here from the slide is that the survey and interviews were in July and August 2020 and queried the first half of the year. So on to those results. One of the survey questions was about the anticipated effect of the lockdown on revenue. And this graph here, the vertical axis is the anticipated percentage change in revenue. And as you can see, there were some wildly optimistic individuals, but the median expectation for is around about a 10% reduction in revenue. The sheep and beef industries being slightly more pessimistic than dairy. In fact, since that time, dairy prices and red meat prices, for that matter as well, have risen. So these anticipated effects back from last year were somewhat pessimistic, it turns out. Another question include pairs of questions about the types of impacts on their businesses and the ability to adapt or mitigate those impacts. The left-hand plot shows the impacts for several categories, and here, the wider the grey bar, the worse the impact. And on the right-hand side, shows the ability of the perceived ability of the businesses to adapt to those impacts or mitigate them. And here, the longer the purple bar, the worse the effect. So just screening out some of the questions that were less interesting and highlighting just 5 of those questions. You can see that the respondents were most concerned about international issues associated with labour or markets, general business risks, and from that, I think you can pretty much read in general uncertainty, and issues associated with getting the inputs they needed to keep their businesses running. The survey included questions with narrative responses, so we pulled out a word cloud. Unsurprising, the most prevalent word was changes, something that I think we can all sympathise with. Another question that we asked was about the anticipation of the length of time it would take before their business would return to some semblance of normality. We asked this about several aspects of the business, and I've summarised that here in a range. Between 45 and 70% of the respondents thought that there would be some sort of return to normality by earlier this year, but some 15 to 30% were more pessimistic, or so we thought back then, and thought that the effects would remain well beyond July 2022. And it's turning out that that seems more and more realistic rather than pessimistic. Given the ongoing effects, beg your pardon, sorry. So onto the findings of the interviews. Here I've grouped, sorry, just a minute. I've grouped here the horticultural crops along with viticulture and broadacre cropping because they experienced similar sorts of effects and concerns. The majority of these, the horticulture and viticultural, not the arable from New Zealand, of course, are exported, and these are primarily by ship and some by air. The majority of the air freight capacity from New Zealand is in the belly of cargo passenger and the cargo belly of passenger flights. So, of course, with all of those flights no longer happening, there was a major issue with that air cargo. The New Zealand government responded by subsidising some dedicated cargo flights, but it was still very tight. New Zealand sources a lot of international specialist equipment, and that goes along with people that are needed for the installation, commissioning and maintenance of that equipment. And this was identified as a key vulnerability for both farmers and processors. And it's something that we really need to keep in mind when we're dealing with more complex systems in the future that need more specialist equipment. Many of these industries are also structurally dependent on large quantities of seasonal labour, and traditionally this has come from backpacking tourists as well as seasonal migrant labour from the Pacific Islands. Losing that labour was a major issue for the horticultural industry, but also for the Pacific Island communities that are quite dependent on the remittances. In some respects, we're a bit lucky from the horticultural industry's point of view with the timing. Just as we went into lockdown, many of the fruit crops are ready to begin harvesting. And they had just enough notice of the lockdown to pre-position workers, the workers that were still in the country, so that they could move on to the next crop. And they managed to muddle through, but they're continuing concerns about what's going to happen over the next few years with either no or vastly reduced migration into the country. More recently, of course, the government signalled that they want to reduce our dependence on migrant labour, and they're encouraging investment in higher tech machinery alternatives. This could assist as labour issues continue into the future, but we have to make sure that we don't replace a dependence on people with or migrant labour people with a dependence on overseas experts for maintaining or commissioning equipment. One positive benefit was that for the farmers growing wheat, normally that wheat would have sat in their silos for 6 months before going to the millers. But New Zealand joined the international lockdown baking movement, and the wheat moved immediately from harvest to millers to supermarkets and off the shelves to home-baked sourdough bread. With the exception of venison, the red meat and dairy industries were among the least affected. All processors found maintaining distance between workers difficult, and it reduced their productivity. But at least it was managed to be able to achieve without disease outbreaks in the plants. They were continually worried about their ability to maintain specialist equipment, as they wouldn't have been able to bring in experts. The chicken and pork industries in New Zealand produce primarily for domestic consumption, and both were challenged with processing throughput. The pork industry faced substantial additional difficulties, and I'll work through those in a bit more detail. This is a food systems diagram that I'm going to use to try and help explain the pork industry and the effects in New Zealand. So the pork is primarily for domestic consumption. It's designed for a steady throughput through, it's designed for a steady throughput, weekly throughput through pigs leaving growers to go onto processors, onto butchers and restaurants. They've got very little ability to store product, and unusually for New Zealand, supermarkets are actually a minor outlet for pork. From a food systems perspective, this is a low plasticity industry because they have limited ability to store product in any way. So what happened was there was a crisis in the health system that triggered a political response to close food outlets except food supermarkets. This meant that the pork industry immediately lost around about 50% of its sales by volume, and also lost the revenue from the higher value cuts of meat that go into restaurants. The processors had no capacity for storage, so the pigs started to accumulate on farm because biology just keeps on happening. And each farm's got limited feed supplies, and even outdoor pigs need shelters, and both were running out. A solution was found through negotiation brokered by the industry body Pork New Zealand. And Pork NZ negotiated with the government to buy pork and donate it to food banks. That helped out with the large number of people that had suddenly become unemployed, and also provided a place to put the product. The agreed purchase price was below the cost of production, so that the Pork NZ negotiation also had to be within the industry to get everybody to accept the same price regardless of their individual price structures. It was a close-run crisis, only days away from an animal welfare crisis, but the industry leadership helped avert this, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. To try and explain the effect of plasticity on resilience, we adapted a framework originally proposed by Filke and colleagues. Each of the major dimensions of an agri-food sector is represented here by a pie slice. The larger the slice, the further it goes out, the larger and the cooler the colour, the greater that particular dimension has to adding to the overall resilience of the sector. Starting with high plasticity sectors. Now, examples of that include forestry, where they can just leave the tree standing for a reasonable length of time. Red meat, where within limits, farmers can choose when to send their animals to the works for processing. And dairy, where they can store milk powder or other products. These are plastic or flexible sectors. Their resilience was largely through production, processing, and economic dimensions. They may have had resilience through their institutional and social dimensions, but it wasn't really needed all that much during the COVID-19 lockdowns in order to achieve that overall industry resilience. Now thinking to the pork industry, which is low plasticity. The lack of plasticity in their production and processing systems and the closure of their markets slammed their economic dimension. This had the potential to crash the overall resilience of the pork sector. However, they strongly engaged the institutional dimension, that's Pork NZ, negotiating solutions with the government and across processes. And that was enabled by a strong social and cultural dimension where their can-do attitudes assisted with those discussions. Overall, the pork sector was resilient, but only just, and it would probably not have been resilient if those other dimensions were not able to compensate. And of course, we're in another lockdown, and that will also affect these low plasticity industries. I've just heard from David Baines, the head of Pork NZ, and so far the pork industry is holding up this time, and they have learned from some of the processes they put in place during 2020. So they have learned from their prior past experience, which is really good to hear.
You've got a 5-minute call.
Thank you. So some final comments. While you get a little bit more New Zealand scenery, that doesn't quite make up for the fact that we're not in Nelson and drinking some wine. We found for those first 6 months, the agri-food industries were resilient, but some of them only just made it through. While international markets for the types of food produced in New Zealand have held up or even improved, international supply chains are alarmingly fragile. Air freight capacity is still low, and sea freight has become slower and more expensive, much more expensive actually. This impacts on obtaining crucial inputs to our farming systems and also the distribution of product to market. We have no idea when this is going to improve, and it's not the only uncertainty in the market. I worry for our horticultural industries and their labour needs in the coming year or more. There is an allocation for migrant labour in the year ahead, but it's well below pre-2020 levels. And the longer term, what we do about labour, freight, and supply chain issues. Sorry, I'll try that again. What do the labour, freight, and supply chain issues mean for New Zealand? Efficiency is good, but it tends to be the enemy of resilience. So how do we become more resilient while also meeting the needs and desires of New Zealanders? These are questions that I think should occupy us more in the time to come than they have in the past. And the next 2 talks in the session will give much more information about the issues of labour and trade, and I look forward to listening to them. I hope this talk has been a very useful scene setter for them. So in closing, nā miti po te whakaronga ki tēnei e whakatāronga, ko tu manaka o ronga koe e tahi kōrera waihua. Me no hohomaru. And thank you, and I'll hand back to Carolyn.